you know the Battle of Monte Cassino as one of the bloodiest Allied victories in Italy. What you don't know is that among the Polish soldiers carrying artillery shells under German fire was a 500-pound Syrian brown bear named Wojtek, officially enlisted with his own rank and serial number. This isn't folklore. British veterans watched in amazement as this massive bear walked upright through the battlefield, cradling ammunition in his arms like a soldier. One British veteran, John Clark, recalled, "Suddenly, a large bear appeared, walking upright on its hind legs, emerging from the trees. It seemed as though the bear was carrying something in its paws." The Polish 22nd Artillery Supply Company was so proud of their four-legged comrade that they changed their official insignia to show a bear carrying a shell. But how does a wild bear become a soldier? The answer takes us back to one of the war's most forgotten tragedies and reveals something extraordinary about the human spirit under impossible circumstances. September 1939. The world watched as Germany invaded Poland. What fewer people remember is that just 17 days later, the Soviet Union invaded from the east. Poland was carved up between two totalitarian regimes, and over 1 million Polish civilians and soldiers were deported to Soviet labor camps in Siberia. For 2 years, they endured conditions designed to break them: starvation, disease, temperatures that could kill in minutes. Then, in 1941, everything changed. Germany invaded the Soviet Union, and suddenly Stalin needed allies. He agreed to release the Polish prisoners and allow them to form an army under General Władysław Anders. These weren't just soldiers anymore. They were walking skeletons, men who had survived the Gulag, mixed with desperate civilian refugees, including women and children. They called themselves Anders's army, but they looked more like ghosts than fighters. Picture this. Spring 1942, somewhere near Hamadan, Iran. The Polish Corps is evacuating through the Middle East, 120,000 people fleeing the Soviet Union with whatever they could carry. The landscape is brutal. Desert heat, dust storms, overcrowded refugee camps. These people have lost everything: their country, their families, their hope of ever going home. It's in this wasteland that a group of Polish soldiers encounter a young Iranian boy walking along a dusty road. In his arms, he's carrying an orphaned bear cub, maybe 2 months old, eyes barely open. The boy's been hand-feeding it with a bottle, but he can't care for it much longer. For most people, adopting a wild animal during a military evacuation would be madness. But these weren't most people. These were men and women who had seen their world destroyed twice over. Private Piotr Prendish looked at this tiny, helpless creature and saw something they all desperately needed. Something to protect. Something innocent. Something that depended on them, instead of the other way around. They bought the cub for a few cans of food and named him Wojtek, Polish for he who enjoys war. The irony wasn't lost on them. Lieutenant Anatol Tarnowiecki watched his men's faces change around this bear cub. Men who had been hollow-eyed and silent began to smile. 18-year-old Irena Bokiewicz, one of the civilian refugees, found herself helping to bottle feed Wojtek and laughing for the first time in months. In the brutal mathematics of survival, This small bear somehow added up to hope. But Wojtek was growing, fast. Within months, he stood 4 feet tall and weighed over 200 pounds. He learned to drink beer, often finishing entire bottles in one go. Soldiers would give him cigarettes, which he would eat rather than smoke, paper and all. He wrestled with the men in their tents, gentle enough never to hurt them, but strong enough to win every match. The 22nd Artillery Supply Company had gained more than a mascot. They had something that made them uniquely, unmistakably alive in a war that was consuming everything human. Then came the problem no one had anticipated. In January 1944, the Polish II Corps received orders to join the Italian campaign. They would board British transport ships and finally return to fighting for Poland's freedom. Except British regulations strictly prohibited animals on military vessels. Commander Antoni Ciałkowski faced an impossible choice: abandon Wojtek or find a way to keep their family together. His solution was bureaucratically brilliant and completely absurd. On paper, Wojtek became Private Wojtek, service number 132 Marcel, officially enlisted in the 22nd Artillery Supply Company with his own paybook and rank. A bear had become a soldier. By May 1944, the Polish II Corps was dug in below the monastery at Monte Cassino, the most heavily fortified position in the German Gustav Line. For months, Allied forces had thrown themselves against these heights and been shattered. The Germans controlled every approach, every road, every supply line. Artillery shells had to be carried by hand through muddy, treacherous terrain under constant enemy fire. This was Wojtek's first real battle. The 500-pound bear was terrified of the explosions. You could see him flinch with each shell burst, ears flattened, eyes wide. But here's what stunned everyone who witnessed it. Despite his fear, he kept working. Soldiers would hand him wooden crates containing artillery shells, each weighing 100 pounds, and Wojtek would cradle them in his massive arms, walking upright like a man. He understood, somehow, that these boxes mattered enormously. When shells burst nearby, he would freeze, trembling, but he wouldn't drop his cargo. As one soldier's daughter later recalled, he absolutely showed that he was scared by the explosions, but he got used to it and was carting artillery around the place in big boxes. The sight was surreal enough that British veterans initially thought it was hallucination or some kind of Polish joke. A massive brown bear moving methodically through a battlefield, delivering ammunition to gun positions while German artillery rained down. But the shells being delivered were real. The Polish advance was real. And after 4 months of Allied failures, Monte Cassino was finally falling. On May 18, 1944, Polish soldiers raised their flag over the ruins of the monastery. The German Gustav Line was broken. The road to Rome lay open. And somewhere in the official records, Private Wojtek had his first combat experience logged. What nobody recorded was this. In the middle of one of the war's bloodiest battles, watching a bear calmly carry ammunition through shellfire had given thousands of soldiers something they hadn't felt in years. Not just hope, but joy. The absurd, ridiculous, impossible joy of seeing something so completely unexpected that it reminded them the world could still surprise them. The 22nd Artillery Supply Company immediately changed their insignia. The new patch showed a brown bear carrying an artillery shell, making Wojtek perhaps the only soldier in World War II to have his portrait become an official military emblem while he was still serving. But here's what haunts me about this story. Wojtek survived the war, emigrated to Scotland with his Polish family, and lived out his days at Edinburgh Zoo. Visitors came from around the world to see the famous soldier bear. Polish veterans would visit him, and according to keepers, Wojtek would always recognize them, standing upright, reaching through the bars, as if he remembered when they had carried shells together through the mud and fire of Monte Cassino. He died in 1903, 18 years after the war ended. Some of those Polish soldiers never got to return to Poland. Their homeland remained under Soviet control for decades. They had fought their way from Siberian gulags to Italian battlefields, had helped break the German line and liberate Rome, only to discover their country was still not free. But they had saved something important. In the worst circumstances imaginable, they had chosen to protect one small, helpless creature. They had taught a wild bear to trust humans, to work alongside them, to become, improbably, impossibly, a soldier. In doing so, they had preserved something essentially human in themselves. The real miracle of Wojtek isn't that a bear learned to carry artillery shells. It's that in the middle of humanity's darkest chapter, a group of broken people chose love over survival, chose family over regulation, chose hope over despair. They created something beautiful in a world designed to destroy beauty. That understanding, it turned out, was enough to help save them in return. And sometimes, when we most need to remember what humans are capable of, it helps to know that once upon a time, in the mountains of Italy, a bear named Wojtek walked upright through enemy fire, carrying shells to Polish guns. Not because he understood the war, but because he understood the men who had chosen to save him.